My guest for this episode is my wonderful friend, Brian Nachreiner. Brian is a gay man in long-term recovery and so much more, which we'll dive into. Welcome to the Element Q podcast. I'm your host, TJ Woodward, and I'm thrilled to have you join us for this empowering journey. Each week, we shine a light on the authors, thought leaders, therapists, coaches, and healers of all types who are making a difference in the LGBTQ plus community. Together, we honor those who came before us, the courageous and resilient trailblazers who stood for our rights and recognition. Their strength laid the foundation we stand on today. Here, we celebrate their legacy by diving into the stories, insights, and tools that inspire gentleness, healing, and transformation. So get ready to be uplifted and empowered. This is the Element Q podcast. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, before the show started, we were talking about the deeper healing within our community. And one of the things that you brought up, which we've talked about several times on this podcast, and I always want to talk more about it, and that is this external homophobia that is happening in the world and in our country, which is always, I've been around long enough to watch that pendulum swing back and forth. And then there's also what we've internalized. And the question that I have for you, just to kind of kick it off, is we could spend hours talking about what's happening in the world, but I really intend for this podcast to offer some help for people to do the inner work, because the outer work, that's just a whole other podcast to me. So based on that, I'm curious about your own journey. I'm curious about what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question and an excellent point of view. I think it is so easy to get lost in the world and the noise that is happening out there that it is, we're reluctant, I feel like, sometimes to look within and actually sort of dive deeper into what that internalized homophobia means to, and I'll speak for myself, for me. I grew up in a Catholic household. So immediately off the bat, there is riddled with judgment and fire and brimstone, and you are not normal if you are any other way but the way that this, specific religion or other religions, tell you how to be. So I remember very early on this feeling of being bad and this inherent feeling of being wrong. And can't necessarily say that that's ever gone away, because it was such an integral part of my growing up, my childhood, and my development that now, even still to this day, I'll do something and I question myself, I second guess myself. And that's not to say that it doesn't, dissipate over time. But initially, my first thought is always, I'm wrong. But now I can pause and take a look and be like, oh, actually, you did the best you could with the information you had, and, sort of open myself up to a little bit more of the positive, enlightening features that are in the life today.
Well, I think what you're speaking to is so important. And in my own experience, it's kind of fascinating, at least to me. Like, I didn't have the religious piece. I grew up in, actually, the church was the safest place for me. I had gay role models in my church, and this is Indiana in the 1970s. So I was extremely fortunate. When culture tells us there's something wrong with us, obviously that has a profound impact. But when someone comes along and tells you this idea of God, and by the way God thinks you're broken or damaged or there's something wrong with you, I think that's such a deeper wound to unlearn or to work with.
I agree with that. It's very much a superficial wound, right? It's, I can point back to, for example, I remember I was in my first job and I was in high school and I was working in a restaurant, and this guy came up to me and he just laid into me about being gay and how I didn't need to be so flaming. I didn't need to be so out there. And I wasn't out at the time. So the fact that somebody could see through my shell really startled me. And that now is a core wound that sticks with me. However, I can point to that wound and I can say, I remember this man doing this. However, when it's God telling you that you're bad or God telling you that you're wrong, it's this figure that I can't pinpoint. I can't put my finger on. I can't look at it. I can't look back to it. I just remember it being over and over and over. You've got a man lays with women, man lays with woman, over and over. That it's like, well, inevitably, it turns into a core belief.
Right. Right, absolutely. And that the key I think to this, and you already alluded to this, is when we receive those messages when we're really young, it's not an intellectual process to heal this because our brains weren't even developed. And I say this all the time, but I think it's so important because a lot of times I think we say things like opposite action or act your way into right thinking or show up and do esteemable acts and you're going to have self-esteem. I think that does help, but I think it's extremely limited because I decided and absorbed I was broken when I was so young. I didn't even have the cognitive understanding of what was happening. And so those wounds are so deep and they're just buried in the unconscious. And like you said, even though on a conscious level, I can say I'm doing the best I can, or I'm doing the best I can with my tools. There's still sometimes this like ache, right? This sense. And I mean, it was certainly true for me throughout my 20s and my 30s. I got sober at 20, right before I turned 21. So my first decade of recovery, my first 2 decades of recovery, I still worked with a lot of shame.
Shame is a really great term for that because I distinctly remember growing up when I had questioned my sexuality and I was starting to have feelings for the same sex that I thought, God, please, like, please let this just be a phase. Please let this something that be that everybody goes through. Please let me be not unique. I don't want to be an individual in this. And realizing that that was in fact not true, that I was in fact gay, and coming to terms with that, and then fast forward to sobriety, where I know people come in and I'll speak for the 12 steps because it's a program that I've worked in and many times over, that I loved the idea that I could create my own God. And the fact that I didn't have to look to this fire and brimstone, I could start with a blank slate. I could start with this clean energy, this clean, beautiful space of compassion and understanding and lack of judgment. That really shifted my eyes. And I think it's a big reason I've been able to stay sober as long as I have.
Yeah. It's interesting though. I'd like to kind of dive into that because I obviously wholeheartedly agree. And I think it's brilliant. It's kind of interesting because my first mentor, Mary Helen, actually knew Ebby. And that goes way back, but Ebby is the person who said to Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, you can't say God, you have to say of your own understanding. Ebby doesn't get credited for being one of the founders of AA because he couldn't stay sober, which I think is all fascinating. He struggled with that. So like he's a little bit of a, cliff note in the history of 12 step, if you will. But I think it's fascinating that Mary Helen, she knew him. And that's just amazing to me. What I want to kind of dive into with that, though, is yes, that's true. We get to create our own idea of higher power. And for some, that's not any at all, right? So in all fairness, and that's one of the things I love about 12 step is it is broad and inclusive. And luckily, Ebby came along and did that in 1930 something. But if there's still this deep seated, because you also spoke to that, like there's still this part of me. What if, I've heard people literally say, what if it is true? What if it is true that there's some God up there or out there that believes there's something fundamentally wrong with me? And even if I intellectually understand that's not true, is there a part of me that still feels that? And then how to work with that?
You bring up a really excellent point, and that ache is still there. And you're absolutely right. And I don't think I've thought about that up until right this moment and you posing that I can acknowledge and I can see people do better. I can see people live by example. I can watch others walk the path that I desire walking. And to simplify it in the most layman of terms, at the end of the day, I just have to accept that it is what it is. It's there. It's not going away. I learned to live with it and embrace it. It's for me, it's very similar to grief. Losing a loved one, losing a family member, losing a lover, like it is absolutely gut-wrenching. And that pain never goes away. It's always going to be there because I always have the memories of that person in my life. And I can now look back at it with a little bit of a chuckle, right? A little bit of a clearer lens to say, like, you're there. I get it. I can see you. I can acknowledge you, but I'm not going to let you define me. I'm no longer going to let you rule and dictate the decisions that I make.
Yes. You know what? I think this is so important because one of the things I don't love hearing in a 12-step meeting is I have a hole inside of me and only God can fill it. And the reason that I'm not a big fan of that is that's still kind of an addictive thought. I need to find
Mhm.
something or someone to fill this hole. And no pun intended on an LGBTQ podcast, but when there's this sense of emptiness and there's something outside of me that needs to replace or fill that or heal that, that's really different than what you're saying, which is there's also, I need to learn to work with this, to walk with this, to be with this, and to realize that even though it is a part of me, it doesn't have to run my life. But that's really different than there's this ache, there's this emptiness, and I'm going to find something outside of myself to fill it up.
And that I feel like speaks to a culture of gay men, right? You're constantly, or a lot of gay men that I know are constantly looking for external validation,
Yeah.
right? Through the apps, through the hookup sites, through the different cruising areas. Like you're just constantly seeking this. I need somebody to say that I'm good enough, and you're very much right with AA feeling like this. Oh, let God fill this hole for you. Well, but why aren't I whole enough? Like I can be who I am. I can be the entirety of myself. And this goes back for me to really early on in treatment. And I got sober in 2013. And this woman named Amanda, she was my therapist in treatment, and she saved my life many times over. But specifically about the grief that I was feeling around the passing of a friend of mine, and she helped me understand that multiple things get to be true.
Mm.
You get to decide. You have the power to pick which one you want to follow. So you can sit in the sadness, which I love to do sometimes. I'm the first one to admit it. I will wrap that wet blanket around myself. But I can also sit in the joy, and I can sit in the melancholy, and I can sit in the anxiety. I get to have all of those and choose which one I'm going to feature most predominantly, and then even take a step back and realize, oh, well, that one's no longer serving me. So let's look at something else.
Well, and what I love about what you're saying too is it's sometimes it's in the sadness that I get to like work through and move through that. I'm thinking about the movie Inside Out where the character's sadness. And I think it wasn't until the third time I saw it. I used to show it to clients when I worked full time in treatment when it first came out. So like I have seen it probably 50 times, no exaggeration. And there's this moment where there's this embracing of the sadness that allows joy to then have a more profound expression. And I do think sometimes there's an energy of let me be rid of this thing that we consider to be negative. That's why I
Mhm.
love to be in the bandwagon of like there's no such thing as a negative emotion. I've actually gone to treatment programs where they have a list of the positive and the negative emotions. And again, that's an addictive thought. Sadness, bad, get rid of. That's an addictive thought. No, sadness, let me allow myself to be with it. And, sometimes in the culture, it's like, oh, you're just in your pity potty. No, I'm actually just allowing myself to feel the sadness. Now, we can get stuck there. But in my
Mhm.
experience, when I've gotten stuck there, it's when I've been trying to avoid it, not when I've allowed myself to feel
Yes.
it. Now, there might be some of us who avoid, and there might be some of us who do kind of swim in that and get stuck in there. I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to this.
I agree. I agree. I've found and a few to touch on a few things that you mentioned. One of the things that AA does that I'm not a huge fan of, and I will work the literature because it is there and it's tried and true. However, I had an amazing sponsor when I first got sober, and we called them qualities, not defects, because a defect is a negative thing, and sometimes it serves me, sometimes it doesn't. And what the steps allows me to do is look at that and note and identify when does it serve me and when can I continue to utilize that. I mean, ego is not always a bad thing. I mean, I have a massive one and I can get in my own way, but it's also gotten me promotions. It's also gotten me to show up for others. It's also gotten me to be the person that I am. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I pretty much like who I am. And I will say, I reached a really, really low point in my sobriety. I was about 3 years sober, and I was actually committed for a 5150 hold. And I won't dive into the details of it, but I definitely hit an emotional rock bottom. And that's because all I believed was the negative. All I believed was nothing is going to save me. God is the only thing out there. And once I realized that I had that power within myself and I was told to get out of my own way and embrace who I am, that's when I started to see things more clearly. And I realized I can hold all of these things at the same time. I
Mm.
can sit in my pity party. And what's funny for me is all of a sudden I'll ask myself, are you just sitting in this to sit in it? And if my answer is yes, I realize it's time to move on, right? Like I've done what I needed to do in that pity party and I learned something from it. I gained some perspective. I was able to process an emotion that was, deeper. And usually it's fear. I mean, TJ, at the end of the day, for me, fear kind of dictates my life. So I get to look at what I'm afraid of. I get to acknowledge what I'm afraid of and move past it and sit in the next thing.
Well, and I love what the late great Wayne Dyer said. He was a person in recovery. He never quite acknowledged it, but he clearly was by a lot of the way that he spoke. But one of the things he said is character defects are simply assets with the volume turned up too high. And I love
I
that
love
because,
that.
like, if you go back, and it's been a while since I've been like had this conversation about 12 step because full transparency, 12 step saved my life. I was an active member for 20 years and then my path took me a different direction. Still love it, but I haven't really been a member for, gosh, I'm coming up on 40 years in a few months. So about half my recovery, I've gone on a different path, but it was such a beautiful foundation. But in AA literature in the 12 and 12, it says index of maladjustments. I love that because, like,
Mhm.
with the volume turned up too high, like I'm a very independent person. So that the light side of that is that I'm an entrepreneur. I start things, I start shows. Let's do a podcast. Let's start a new business. And that's a wonderful thing. When it's turned up too high, then it shows up as I don't need anyone. I'm fine. I isolate. I
Mm.
don't ask for help. I remember one time I was like standing on a table trying to hang a banner, and my friend Summer looked at me up at me and she said, "Do you struggle with asking for help?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah." Right. So it's like
Yes, I
that to
do.
balance that, an index of maladjustments that really works for me, or thinking about the volume with it. And when it's something that's an asset at its core, or an automatic response from a wound in childhood, I can have compassion for that rather than thinking of it as
Mm.
defective inherently.
I love that idea of looking at it with compassion. And that's something that I don't do frequently enough because I am definitely my own worst critic. And I talk to my business partner about this a lot. Her and I, neither of us take compliments very well. So we have made it our mission to compliment each other until we believe it. And because of that, her and I have sort of digested like, why do we do that? Why don't we like our compliments? And it's because to us, perfect is expected, right? It's not exceptional. It's the bare minimum. And when I get to look at what others are doing and when I get to pause and say, you know what, you are doing a really, really great job, that compassion that I have for myself is so powerful. And it is the turn up that my ego needs without cranking it to the max volume and breaking the windows.
Oh my gosh, this is so cool because I think there's something about compassion and there's something about looking, just, I call it compassionate curiosity, right? When I can have
Mm.
compassionate curiosity, I can start to look at the root of something instead of just the behavior. And I think so much treatment and so many modalities and so many support groups focus so much on behavior, which obviously is important. But I'm thinking about your story. I'm thinking about my story because my story, when I was 18 months or 2 years sober, I found myself suicidal. I could have probably been 5150, but I wasn't. But I was in a place where I didn't know what to do. And I felt
Mm.
that emptiness came back, right? And the emptiness that I'd been running from through my addiction and then honestly running from in my early recovery. My first sponsor said, pull out the calendar. It was back in the day when we had folding calendars. He's like, circle one day a week that you're not allowed to go to a meeting. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm such a good, I was going to like 12 meetings a week. And he's
Oh
like,
my
you
gosh.
need to learn how to sit with yourself. And you're going to circle
Mm.
one day a week and you're going to sit with yourself. And I thought, who would want to do that? Right. But so when I was 18 months or 2 years sober, and all of this stuff came up, what I came to understand is I had been running from the shame and running from the trauma that I was afraid to look at and really disconnected from the truth of who and what I am. And the external, and this is what I wanted to kind of explore with you, because in my model conscious recovery, I say there's a place within us, or underneath all our addictive behavior, there's a place within us that's whole and perfect. This is
Mm,
really different than perfectionism because for me, and this might not be true for anyone else, but for me, the perfectionism was a strategy to manage my feeling unworthy and not good enough. It was a behavior
absolutely.
to try to manage something that felt broken. The deeper work that was required from me, and Mary Helen took me on this beautiful journey, was to understand that I didn't come in with that brokenness. I didn't come in as defective. I came in as a whole spiritual being. And then I started to fragment and separate from that and started believing all these lies about myself. And like you were saying, when I worked in treatment, the clients, many clients, a high percentage, maybe 80% of clients in treatment struggled way more with hearing something kind about themselves than anything that felt
Mm.
like conflict.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head, so to speak, because I very similar. I was, about 3 years sober when I hit my rock bottom, and I remember this feeling of dark and empty and being alone, and and that's why I'm a really, how do I say this eloquently? I'm really humbled by how far AA has come, and I'm a little bit of an AA nerd in some aspects. I'm not like a big book thumper, and I'm not going to quote the book, but I've read enough of the history about it to understand that back in the day, like they weren't allowed to take external medications that were prescribed. It was very rigid, and now like. It takes a village to keep me sane and sober. I go to outside therapy. I work a program. I go to meetings here and there, not as much as I could, but also enough to sustain myself. And with all of these little pieces, like you're talking about, it makes me whole again. My therapist works on my mental health, and I get to dissect things that I can't say in a meeting, or I wouldn't feel comfortable saying in a meeting. Sobriety meetings focus on the physical sobriety, right? My gym is a form of a meeting, like going there and working out, like that keeps me healthy. And I feel like you also mentioned something that I'm sitting with and that's very interesting is the compartmentalization that we all do.
Yeah.
Taking this and putting it in that box, taking this and putting it at that box. And the older I get, the more I can see these boxes piling up. And I'm starting to wonder if there might be an age very soon where I need to start unpacking some of those boxes and looking at what's inside. But I'll save that for another day.
Or not. Maybe we just dive right in right now. No, I mean, I agree because I'll put it this way. I absolutely thought there was a finish line to healing, and let's just say it would have been a long time before now, right? And I've come to realize that there's always another level if I'm willing. And that's one of the beautiful things about being in recovery is that it in some ways it requires it, or at least we have a belief system that it requires it. Like if I don't do enough of my healing, I eventually am going to want to go back to the checkout, right? And the checkout for many of
Mm,
us doesn't need to be our original addiction because I've had plenty of things I've done addictively in recovery, right? I haven't relapsed since the day I walked into a meeting in 1986. And then therapy and all the things and spiritual community, which ultimately became my next path. But in on some level, it became profoundly simple, and that is when I do enough of the healing that I love myself enough, I have compassion enough for myself, my younger self. For me, it really, there was a point when it was about really going in and doing the deeper inner child work because when I was 7, I was so afraid that I just completely closed off. And I
mm,
stayed closed off until I was 14 when I discovered weed and alcohol. And so those lost years were really painful. And I just didn't want to look at those. And so to be able to like find a place of compassion and love for that part of me has allowed me to not want to medicate. I mean, it
mm.
becomes so profoundly simple. The last thing I'll say about this, my friend Doug, when I got sober, he was 10 years sober. So he must be 50 years sober, coming on 50 years. But he was 14 when he got sober. And so people would say to him, how do you know you're an addict? He's like, I don't know if I am or not. That's not the valuable question. And I just loved
It's
that.
not.
He said,
It's
why
not the
would I
valuable
want to
question.
change my life? I've discovered this beautiful life in recovery, and who would want to medicate that? That phrase has always stuck with me.
I love that. Wow. Sober 14. That's impressive.
Yeah.
I and that gives me some hope to remind myself, like if I ever start questioning, like, are you sure you were an addict? Like, that's not the important question. That's not the one that matters. What matters to me is the growth that I've had, the progress that I've made, the acceptance that I've found within myself more than anything. My current sponsor always says, what would the little child in you want to do?
Yeah.
Right? Like what would that little boy say to you right now? The pure one, not the one that was tainted or bullied or, beat down, like the one before all of that, when
Yeah.
everything was wholesome and pure. And I said, this is something I've been thinking about a lot. I just celebrated a birthday. So, that kind of brings me almost a new year, new perspective. And I keep thinking about how creative I was as a child,
Mm.
right? How I used to play, quote, house with my sisters, and we used to play school, or, like we had these make believe cities and all of that. And I don't do that anymore. And part of me wants to get back to that. And that's why I'm so envious of people that are artsy or that are artists or in the community. I'm like, what can I do to unleash some of that creativity within me? And so I picked up my journal and I've started journaling again. I mean, that's, I feel like, the easiest first step.
I love it. And you're also speaking like for me, and this is the essence of what happened for me with my work with Mary Helen, and 2 years sober, whenever that was. It's a little bit of a blur, but it was really about getting in touch with that essential self that, in a spiritual term, we might call that our God essence, Buddha nature. In, maybe more practical terms, it's that little innocent child that before we were, living from our woundology, as my friend Temple says, when I had that pure essence and conscious recovery, that's become the essence of it. Recovery isn't about moving towards something. It's about discovering and unlearning so that we can return to that place of inner perfection. And when I'm in that vibration, because it becomes so simple, I've caused a lot of harm in the world, and it was always when I believed I was broken. I've
Yeah.
experienced a lot of love in the world, and it's almost always when I believed I was lovable and a whole and complete person. So it becomes so profoundly simple, but it does require that I pretty much question everything I've ever believed, every idea. And this is where I do think that the evolution of the recovery movement is still, in my experience, needs a little bit more, because I still think there is so much identification with what's broken, so
Mhm.
much identification, and what that's so important in the beginning, but not for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and 40 years. It's a
Very much
different
agreed.
conversation.
Agreed. And for me, the first 3 years was really about physical sobriety, right? It was about staying sober. And I threw myself in. I threw myself into the organizations, to the volunteers, to the meetings, to all of that. But eventually it did become this, I need to work on that inner self. I need to work on the mental aspect of it. And a good friend of mine, Teresa, would say, well, after you hit 5 years sober, you're no longer a newcomer. And I kind of took that to heart. And I was like, okay, now the real work begins, right? I've maintained sobriety for a decent length of time, a handful of years. And now I get to look at those really old wounds, the ones that I haven't touched or haven't acknowledged or haven't even put a finger on in decades. And that's been a really painful journey. That's been probably the hardest part about staying sober.
Yeah. And I think in some paradigms, and I've seen this happen, when we say things like, well, I just have this disease, or I'm just an effed up alcoholic, or I just have this, now in the treatment industry, I don't know if you know this, Brian, but we're classifying it as a brain disease. It's like, oh my gosh. Okay, there's so much more here, right? There's so much more than just that. And what you're saying is so true, right? Like once the fog lifts, and once, because for me it was like just staying sober was enough for so long. Just having
Mhm,
a community
mhm.
was enough. But then I got to meet myself, and meeting myself was really painful. And I remember my first sponsor, Scott, said there will come a moment when no one will answer the phone. This was before texting, before phones in our pockets, before any of that. And there won't be a meeting for you to go to, and you'll have to meet yourself. And I remember driving to a meeting. For whatever reason, I was confused. It wasn't happening. And I was sitting in the parking lot in my little VW Bug. I don't know what year that was, but I had my little Volkswagen Bug. And I remember just feeling this sense of trying to run from the experience of now. And I thought, this is what
Mm.
Scott meant. This is the moment. Because we didn't have phones then. I couldn't just randomly call someone or distract myself with social media. So I just sat in that parking lot and sobbed. And it was not the last time, but one of the first times when I understood the power and the beauty of just meeting myself.
Mm. And to me, I feel you just described meditation to me
Mm.
in a nutshell. And I'm not knocking on meditation. I thoroughly enjoy it. For me, for my personal version of meditation, is it's not speaking with a higher power. It's not listening to a higher power, which it can be for some people, and I can respect that. But for me, it's about meeting myself, because how many times a day am I alone with myself? I'm not. Even now with texting and calling, and people are 100% available all the time. I'm again looking for validation. I'm looking for someone to sign my BS. And I don't need that. If I just sit within myself, if I cross my legs, if I close my eyes and I take a few deep breaths in and out, I get to see who is underneath all of that.
Yes, and I love what Pema Chodron says. When I heard, well, I heard someone else say this, but then Pema Chodron says this too. She says, we often think of meditation as the experience of bliss, and we might chase that in our meditation.
Mm.
Our experience when we're brutal with ourselves and it's painful to sit there for one more minute, that might be just as useful. And I love that, right? Because I get to see myself. And if I can, as Krishnamurti says, the highest form of human intelligence is to see myself without judgment. When I can just look and say, wow, I have a lot of ways I distract. I have a lot of ways I criticize. And if I'm criticizing myself, I'm criticizing the world. No other possibility exists, right? So, meditation is an opportunity not necessarily to feel better, but to feel better, as we've often heard.
I love that. I really love that. I went to a meditation meeting a few weeks ago, and it was the first time I had meditated in quite some time. I was so irritable, restless, and discontent by the end of it. I didn't want to be in my own head anymore, and I was angry, and I was judging myself so hard. And I mean, there was this dichotomy in my head. And I came home and I sat for another couple of minutes and I thought, just give yourself a break. You haven't meditated in maybe, 6 months. Like, you're not going to do this perfectly. You're meeting yourself again for the first time. You haven't said hello in 6 months. Things change, people change, circumstances change. So you get to learn this person all over again. And he's there and he's willing to. He's there all the time. All you have to do is close your eyes and take a couple of deep breaths.
Yeah, and maybe that awareness for me, the awareness of the inner critic, the awareness of the part of me that is loving and that is that can be brutal, is both really useful because then, and you alluded to this or even said it directly earlier, I get to choose which one I want to live from, right? So like,
Mm.
yeah, that I really thought that my mind would stop doing this. I thought it would just be like lake, like just very calm lake, right? And it is
Mhm.
sometimes, but it also can still judge or still have ideas or still get in fear. And the difference, and it's a profound difference, is I can see that for what I have, not who I am. And that distinction, not as a concept, but as an actual embodied awareness has changed everything. It's like, there I am doing that again. Thank you, mind, for thinking. Thank you, lungs, for
Mm.
breathing. Thank you, heart, for pumping blood.
At the core of it all, it is gratitude. And there is one thing that you just had said something that makes me. I don't have very many AA phrases that I cling on to, but one of them is progress, not perfection, because progress is all I can ask of myself. I can just put my left foot in front of my right foot and keep walking forward. I can stop, I can look within, but I have to keep moving. And I'm not going to do it perfectly. I'm going to take a couple of steps back, and that's fine. At the end of the day, it's progress, because sometimes taking a step back gets me three more steps forward. I don't know what that's going to look like. So I think that's absolutely beautiful, that like looking within and just accepting myself as completely whole and perfect. That's amazing.
Yeah. And believe it or not, we've come to the end of our time. That went very quickly, and I think it's interesting because my mind, I was noticing my mind while you were talking, saying, "Did we really talk about internalized and externalized homophobia?" We actually really did, because this is all
Mhm.
the ways for me that I have worked with that. Because that internalized homophobia for me is just another way to say shame, another way to
Shame.
believe I'm broken and the things I've absorbed. So I think we've talked about some really important ways to frame and reframe and work with it in a different way. So I just want to say thank you, Brian, for this incredible conversation. Of course, I'll let you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to have, but I just want to say thank you for this. And it's been a minute since I've like kind of reminisced about the 12 steps and how it did save my life. And I love that. And I have nothing but just respect and admiration for it. And so, yeah, so thank you very much for that. Anything you want to say in closing?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This has been a very enlightening conversation, as well as a grounding conversation for me. I think more importantly, I, I will close with, over the last 2 weeks, I have made a conscious effort to decide that I am going to have a good day today. I'm going to have a
Mm.
great day today, that things are going to be good. And it's not always good, but guess what? My mindset is there so that I can turn it around and I can roll with the punches and I can appreciate for me. I can appreciate and have so much gratitude for the things that go right.
And I love that because it goes back to that simple thing that we've said a few times throughout our conversation, and that is I get to choose where I put my focus. I don't need to eradicate or get rid of or get rid of negative thinking or no longer have judgment. I can just see it for what it is and say, I'm not going to entertain that today. I'm going to choose something different. So thank you. And thank you everyone for tuning in. And if this conversation has meant something to you, or if there's someone in your life who you think it might help, please share it. Like and subscribe because it does make a difference. So peace and blessings, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Element Q podcast. It's an honor to walk this path of healing and transformation with you. Remember, the courage and resilience of those who came before us live on in each of us. Let's continue to carry their legacy forward as we support one another in creating a world filled with love, gentleness, and empowerment. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we're building a brighter future, one story at a time. Until next time, I'm TJ Woodward, and this has been the Element Q podcast.